here that's in your program, and I'm going to ask them to speak for about 5 to 8 minutes, telling you a little bit about themselves and their crisis management background. We have very different experiences on our panel today, and we're going to try to have a good length of time to have questions. So with that, Molly, I'll be glad to turn it over to you.
Great. Now, would you like me to stand and talk?
You can sit right there or whatever you're most comfortable with.
I'm going to sit since you're all sitting. Can you guys sit? I should just stand, so I'll stand.
Okay.
All right. Hi, so I'm Molly Gaines McCullum. I'm with CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I work in the Emergency Risk Communication branch. So essentially what my job is when there's an emergency activation and CDC responds, then I'm part of the Joint Information Center, which coordinates all of the information coming into CDC through media, social media, questions to CDC, Congress, other foreign governments. And then we coordinate all of the information that comes out from CDC for public health emergencies. So I know this panel is on crisis communication, and I am definitely the public health side of crisis communication. My specific job is to work in outreach, so we speak with partner organizations and individuals who are directly impacted by an emergency or disaster. But as part of that, I brought my visual aid, we also do the Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication, or CIRC program. Has anyone here heard of CIRC before?
Sorry.
I love it. Good. We've stacked the panel. And I'll just mention that we do have some resources available online, many more than I'll be able to talk about in 5 to 8 minutes. But you can reach those at emergency.cdc.gov/CIRC, and I'd be happy to actually give that address to you again at a better time. But we do have a full 434-page manual on a variety of different crisis emergency risk communication topics. There are 13 chapters, and it is available for free on the website, as well as a 3-hour online training that's really tailored more towards the States, but I think also has some global implications as well. So what I wanted to do is just give a brief overview of this program, the 6 main principles that CIRC talks about. And again, this is very much specifically for public health emergencies, but I think that it can be applied to other situations as well. And they should all be fairly easily grasped. I think a lot of them you're going to find are kind of intuitive. So there are 6 main principles. Be first, be right, be credible, express empathy, promote action, and show respect. So going through them really briefly, the first is whenever there is an emergency, a crisis, something where you have a lot of heightened emotion, where there's a lot of time sensitivity, where you need to give information to people as soon as possible, and whether that's to save their lives, to protect their property, to protect their families, or to protect their livelihoods, you want to make sure that you communicate as soon as you possibly can all of the information that you have. And that's going to help you establish your credibility. It's going to help people know that they can come to you if they have any other information needs, if they have questions. And you know, in general, the first message that people hear is oftentimes the one that they're going to remember, and they're going to compare every message that they hear after that to the first message. So if the first thing that you say is, this explosion was caused by terrorism, is that the first thing that people hear, every single thing that they hear after that, whether or not they heard that it was an industrial accident or whatever else, they're going to be thinking, but no, didn't I hear that it was terrorism? So if you have the correct facts, make sure you get them out as soon as possible. Second piece is be right. So obviously it's not enough to be first if you don't have correct information. When you have the correct information, that also helps you build your credibility and your partnership with your audience. But being right is not just having all of the information, because of course, during an emergency, you're never going to have all of the information that you need at the time when you need it. I mean, that's just never going to be the case. So being right has to do with telling people what you do know, and then telling them what you're still investigating, and how you're investigating, and how you're going to get those answers for people. And if possible, giving people a time frame. So what I do know is that there is a hurricane. This is an example. What I do know is that there is a hurricane that is forming over the Atlantic Ocean. But I'm not sure is quite where it's going to make landfall yet, but we're working with our meteorologists to determine that. And we will let you know by Monday morning what evacuation plans should be. Right? So you tell people what you do know, what you're still investigating. You're never telling people, I don't yet know whether or not the hurricane is going to be hitting. You're going to kind of phrase it differently. but here's what we're still trying to find out, and here's how we're finding it out. Then the third, again, really kind of obvious, underlies everything, is to be credible. Build trust with the people that you're speaking with. If people don't trust you, they're not going to believe any single thing that you say. And it doesn't matter if you're first, it doesn't matter if you're right, they're not going to believe you. If you have already lost credibility, or if, for instance, your organization is part of an incident, you think about something, like a man-made accident or something where you and your organization have already lost credibility, the important thing is still to get information out to save lives, to protect people. So go ahead and work through a different partner. I know one of the things that CDC sometimes does, especially in foreign countries where maybe we're a little less trusted than others, is we just strip off our branding. We give people the correct information, but we say, look, here's a partner organization that's much better trusted. We give them the fact sheet. We let them put their branding on it. We let their spokespersons have the press release and press conferences. And that way, again, our interest is to protect people, but that way we do have that sort of credibility through a second partner. So be right, be credible, really flying through these. The fourth is to express empathy. So empathy, as opposed to sympathy, is when you are putting yourself in the shoes of the person experiencing this emergency. But I said express empathy, not feel empathy. It's really nice if you can feel empathy for your audience, right? It's nice if you can really understand what they're feeling, and I think a lot of us can. But what's more important is to tell people that you know how they feel. Not by saying, I know exactly how you feel, but by demonstrating that you understand their emotions. So you can say something really simple like, this is a really scary, uncertain time. And that helps people know that you are feeling the same feelings that they feel, or at least you identify them. And that you're not just thinking about the facts of the emergency, but you're also thinking about the psychological, the emotional implications. It really helps you take away some of that distance between you and the people you're speaking to by letting everybody know that you're also kind of all in the same boat and feeling the same things. The fifth is to promote action, which essentially is to make sure that you do have a couple action items for people to take. When you give somebody something concrete to do, that helps them feel like they're taking a little bit of control back in this very uncertain emergency. So it can be something very concrete, like you need to evacuate, or you need to boil your water before you drink it. But if you don't have those types of action items, you can also say something like, stay tuned for more information. I will come back to you on Monday with more information. And asking people to stay engaged with you, that's still an action. And again, it helps people feel like they're taking back some control. And then finally, show respect, which obviously should underlie everything that you're doing, which involves not just showing respect for people on a human level, but also recognizing that everybody is making the best decisions that they can for themselves and for their families and loved ones, and really respecting their right to make those decisions, even if it goes against your guidance and working with them. So that was a very, very brief rundown of something that usually takes 8 hours to do. And I'd be really happy to speak with anybody afterwards and point you to some of our further resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mom. Trevor, can you slide out from there? I will let you do your
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenji Tateiwa. I work out of the Washington, D.C. office of Tokyo Electric Power Company. Today, I'd like to share with you the first-hand account of the Fukushima nuclear accident and the lessons learned from the point of view of crisis communications. My background, I did my bachelor's and master's in nuclear engineering at Kyoto University in Japan. Joined TEPCO immediately after that. First worked at Fukushima Daini nuclear power station, the sister plant of Fukushima Daiichi. Then I got my MBA from Stanford, and then after going back to TEPCO again, I spearheaded TEPCO's global international nuclear development. And my company TEPCO, we started to get involved in the nuclear new build in the U.S. In Texas, South Texas project. They have a plan to build 2 Japanese reactors, and we were asked to provide technical assistance and also become an equity investor. So I had the pleasure of traveling to Texas multiple times, maybe more than 20 times. And in that process, I got pretty good at my third language. So I was telling people, howdy all, and I'm fixing to build some nuclear in Texas. But then, March 11, 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake struck the northeastern coast of Japan. I was in downtown Tokyo when the earthquake struck. Even in downtown Tokyo, several hundred miles away from the epicenter, it was an enormously large earthquake. Japan is an earthquake-prone country. I've experienced hundreds of earthquakes, but this was totally different. It was, in fact, the largest earthquake and tsunami in recorded history of Japan. 20-plus meter tsunami runoff spanning 200 kilometers. Compared to this area, it's a distance between Savannah, Georgia, and Jacksonville, Florida. Totally flooded areas the size of 10 times the size of Manhattan Island, leading to 19,000 people that were still missing due primarily to the tsunami. But then, on top of all of that, TEPCO, we had 2 nuclear power stations, Fukushima Daiichi with 6 reactors, Fukushima Daini, where I worked at, with 4 reactors. You have heard a lot about Fukushima Daiichi accident, but in fact, Fukushima Daini with the 4 units, those 4 units were in very critical condition as well in the first several days. And I was coping with the situation from the Tokyo Emergency Response Center. And this provides an overview of how or what TEPCO and my colleagues had to deal with in terms of a 10-unit simultaneous accident. It's difficult to figure out what this table is showing, but in red indicates the 5 reactors at Fukushima Daiichi entered into the so-called station blackout. No means to put water into the core, no means to reject heat from the containment. Orange is slightly less severe, but still loss of alternate heat sink, meaning we can put some water into the reactor but could not reject the heat from the containment, so the pressure was accumulating. So even at Fukushima Daini, it doesn't show, but Fukushima Daini with 4 reactors, which you don't hear about often, entered into loss of alternate heat sink for 3 out of 4 reactors. And as we made some progress in responding to the situation, on the second day, Unit 1 reactor building at Fukushima Daiichi exploded, followed by, on the 4th day, Unit 3, and then on the 5th day, Unit 4. So all of this happening, and I can't really go into the technical details today, but I would like to talk about communications. Although I was not a communications expert, I was dragged into communicating with the global community. One, because I was an expert in severe accident. So my specialty was to prevent such things from happening and how to respond if it were to happen. And because I was able to talk Texan and English, among other languages, I was asked to communicate with the global community. And the first thing I had to do was to translate all the press releases that TEPCO sent out or made public in Japanese, and I had to translate because I was about the only guy who understood the technical details and could translate that without consulting with any other people. I also got to interact with many of the embassies in Japan. This photo was one specific day when I went to the delegation of the European Union, but individually I visited 15 or 16 embassies in Japan, based in Tokyo. It was extremely important for us to have face-to-face meetings with the people at the embassies because, as Molly mentioned, credibility was critical, providing correct information was critical, but in our case, in this case, we ourselves did not have correct information. We didn't know for sure what was happening because of the earthquake and specifically tsunami. We lost power, all power at the power plant. And even our operators who were at the site didn't know what was happening. They lost all the instrumentation. They had no clue what was happening in the core. But we had to communicate, obviously, to tell the world what was happening, what we believed was happening. But we lost credibility instantaneously because we couldn't tell exactly what was happening. We were bombarded with questions, and we had to say we don't know what was happening. So we thought that we were hiding something, but in reality, we had no reason to hide. We just didn't know what was happening. But at least with the face-to-face meetings, we could go and tell the embassy staff members that these are the things that we know, these are things that we do not know, but we're here to answer any questions to the best of our ability. The first time I went up to the Fukushima Daiichi site, April 6th, it was the 4th week after the accident occurred, with the International Atomic Energy Agency preliminary delegation. It was very important for outside experts to come to the site and have a first-hand look at what was happening, and we told them what we knew at the time. And it was also good for myself to have first-hand view, so that after coming back to Tokyo and then coming to DC, I could tell people this is what we saw on the 4th week, and so it was more convincing for me as a community. The second, well, actually this is the 3rd time we went up to the site, May 27th. It was more than 2 months after the accident, but I saw my colleagues sleeping on the floor on the site, and still many of them struggling to cope with the situation, an extremely challenging situation. But the IAEA fact-finding mission led by Dr. Wakeman, the then head of the UK nuclear regulator, it was very important for us to have a highly credible, authoritative organization come and see, and then on behalf of us tell the world the factual account of what's happening. For me personally, among the multiple global organizations that we interacted with, the U.S. nuclear industry played a critical role. INPO, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, actually based in Atlanta. I had a half-day meeting yesterday with the INPO folks, but they sent us a group of highly experienced, motivated engineers, some with a 3 Mile Island accident response experience, to help us on a pro bono basis. And they mentioned that nothing has been important in their career than supporting TEPCO. It was this kind of moral support that greatly helped us keep on coping with this very challenging situation. So this is my final slide. So from a communications point of view, since my stint in DC in September 2011, I've had a pleasure and a great opportunity to talk in multiple occasions, including this one, close to 200 times, communicating with various organizations from the nuclear industry, government agencies, professional organizations, and so forth. But it's very important to build a personal trust relationship in order for people in the audience to learn from us and be able to candidly and frankly communicate, and so that we can share information, you can ask questions, we'll respond to the best of knowledge that we know. But in any ways, I truly appreciate having this opportunity today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. All right, Lee, turn it to you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to sit down. I don't have an easy way out either way. I'm going to sit tight. But thank you for joining us this afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Gainey on a number of occasions in the past several years. She's developed the curriculum for crisis management at Kennesaw State, and I'm just very impressed with everything that she's done. And I think it's a testament to the importance of crisis management, not just as an academic area or an educational area, but frankly as a practical area for any business leader. There are two things that are certain about crisis management. One is every crisis is different, and the second is you're going to be in one. And that's an absolute at some point in your career, and I think everyone on the panel will probably agree with that. The scope, who knows, it could be small, it could be substantial, like the Fukushima, which is still ongoing. It may go on for some period of time in the future. A couple things I wanted to just sort of share with you as we get started. Really, the whole principle, the principles behind crisis management are very simple, in my opinion. The challenge always is the execution. Are you trained? Have you got good people? Are you following protocol? Are you exhibiting the characteristics that Molly was referring to? Empathy, demonstrating credibility, providing correct information. That's all the hard part. But I've always looked at crisis management as sort of built on a three-pronged stool, three-legged stool. And the first tenet of great crisis management is honesty. Now, honesty, people have different interpretations of it. Some people may be more honest than others. But the key thing to keep in mind when you're in the fog of a crisis in those first hours after something breaks, keep in mind that people crave information. When there is a lot of uncertainty, people really crave information to make them feel more at ease, to see or to have confidence in what you as a crisis manager may be sharing with them. So it's important, as best you're able to do, to be honest about the crisis. Now, honesty doesn't mean you have to tell everybody everything, because you don't, and I wouldn't recommend that you do. But what you tell them needs to be factual. And facts don't have to be elaborate, they can be very simple, such as you're an hour into a crisis situation, you are before the news media who gathered at your plant for the first time, you make a statement that's maybe 60 seconds, 90 seconds in length, and you cover some of the very essential information that you know people want to hear from you. Who was hurt? Are people okay? What are you doing about the situation? How are you taking care of the folks who are injured? How does it affect my local community? Can I still drive on a certain road that goes by your plant? So some of the fundamental information is rather easy to provide. It will be accurate, and it's what people are expecting from you. Certainly never recommend that you try to speculate or make assumptions about what may or may not happen, because I guarantee you're not going to be 100% accurate. And as Molly also mentioned, the first thing that you say to people is probably going to be the bulk of what they remember, at least in the early hours of the crisis response situation. So honesty. The second tenet of great crisis management, in my opinion, is speed. The challenge with reacting quickly and with sharing information quickly is very obvious. What if you don't know anything? How can you respond? How can you respond quickly? I think the answer to that is your mere presence among your stakeholders, among your local community members, is a strong enough statement, I think, to let them know that they have a face, that they can now associate with the response to the crisis, and they can rely on that person or that group of people to provide information. But it has to be done quickly. The luxury of time, I'm sorry to tell you, is not something that you have in a crisis. And I don't need to emphasize that the fact that social media has changed all of that forever. There are more experts now in the world than there ever were before because of social media. Everybody knows something about everything we hear about. So the challenge in sort of getting through that clutter of social media conversation is really tough in a crisis moment, as you might expect. A lot of confusion, a lot of false information being shared through social media. And I don't think it's wrong for people to talk about a crisis through their social channels when the crisis is evolving. It's a way for people to, perhaps vet things, connect with other people who may have more information than they do. But they're looking for accuracy, they're looking for honesty, and they're looking for information quickly, and that's what social media, I think, can now do. In fact, I think that social media may be the greatest, most recent asset to good crisis management practices that we have. You still have to be smart, you got to be quick on your feet, you have to use good instincts, and you have to follow good protocol. But social media gives you the chance to make that speed tenet, that second thing, really happen. And the final thing I would say, in addition to honesty and speed, is solution. And solution can take on many forms during the course of a crisis management exercise. I think the most important thing in your initial communications about crisis is to talk about solution early. We may not know exactly what has happened here, but we're working diligently to make sure it's not going to happen in this way again. As we find out evidence, we're going to see how we can correct that, improve it, and improve our whole response. I think that is something that most people also expect to hear is, what are you doing to solve it? Or at least, what are you doing to solve part of it? Or at least, are you trying to solve it? I think that's really important. Now, in the case of Fukushima, here you have a global, galactic catastrophe with so many complicated elements. And Kenji is right when he was saying that they just didn't know really many answers in the initial days. But attacking it as they did, gathering teams from all over the world and experts and great minds and great communicators was at least one way to get that started. So honesty, speed, and solution, that's sort of your pyramid, and I'm looking forward to expanding on that.
Okay. Thank you. Roger Williams is here from Conan Wolf.
Hey there. I am with Conan Wolf. We're a global public relations agency. We have offices around the world, and my role is leading our crisis and issues management practice in North America. It's a fantastic role in that I get to do crisis every day, and I get to do it in a vast array of industries. I have tremendous amounts of respect for people who work within a specific sector, because you end up with this massive amount of technical expertise. You understand the full environment, the stakeholders at play, the regulatory environment that you've got to contend with. I have to be a bit of a jack of all trades because our firm represents everything from Jif peanut butter to the world's second largest paper producer, Asia Pulp and Paper. And that exposes me to such an incredible array of problems that my job is frankly fascinating, and I love going to work every day. And I don't love it when my phone goes off at 2 in the morning because something has happened, but that's part of the business. My background, I started in the agency world and gravitated towards the issues and crisis side of things. I went in-house with Delta Airlines for a few years. I was national media spokesman there. So I got my butt kicked in the New York Times on a regular basis. I went to an energy company then and did their media relations function. I've been back on the agency side for about 10 or 11 years now. And in that time, you get to live all of the tenets of crisis communications that some of my colleagues have spoken about, and absolutely agree with all of those things. There's a fact that is really presenting itself these days when you start to talk about crisis and issues management that I think has not been part of the dialogue around crisis historically. And when we talk about crisis preparedness, people automatically think you need to have a good crisis communications plan, you need to identify your spokespeople, you need to put resources in place. But preparedness these days really needs to incorporate a lot of front-end work to build an organization's reputation. Our firm conducted a global study last year, and we're doing it again for 2015, that looked at the tenets of communications overall and what consumers and people in the public view as critical elements for believability, trust, engagement with the companies that they choose to do business with and those that they choose to not do business with. And this theme of authenticity came as a result of that. There is something to be said for having a very visible presence, whether it's with your customers or your stakeholders, your business partners, the regulatory community, the analyst side of things if you're a publicly held company, that speaks volumes to how effective you can be when you do have a crisis or issue come up. The believability factor goes way up when you've been engaging with those folks in advance of a crisis. One of my clients that I worked with for a couple years, Asia Pulp and Paper, is that massive global paper producer. They're number 2 in the world. For years and years, they did not communicate effectively. Even within their home country of Indonesia, there was not a lot of outward communication. Massive organization, hectares and hectares of rainforest cleared for paper production, plantations, a number of mills in China that they operate. So it's an appropriate kind of company for this kind of conference to speak to because of the global nature of the business. They sell into over 120 countries around the world, and as a result of their practices, took a great deal of criticism from organizations like Greenpeace, WWF, Rainforest Alliance, and it forced that organization to put in place a forest conservation policy. We worked with them on their communications efforts throughout the last 4 years, taking them from a company that frankly did not communicate to putting a communications program in place, to getting them engaged with stakeholders, including the NGOs like Greenpeace that were their detractors forever, to putting in place this much more transparent organization. They still make mistakes, but they report the mistakes. And it's a very different environment for their customers. They were targets that were losing business because of their practices and because of the campaigns that were put in place against them. And it was very challenging to manage those concerns on their behalf and with them. But once they moved to a more transparent kind of environment where there was reporting, there were metrics put in place, there were third parties that analyzed the work that they were doing in the field, there were protocols put in place that aligned with the various regulatory structures in the EU, in the US. Everything's got very nuanced regulatory environments that you've got to contend with on a global scale. Once they started to put all those steps in place, business started coming back. Their perception of the industry shot back up. And they're, frankly, a success story for how you manage an issue effectively over time. It took a long time to get there for them, but there are tons and tons of lessons to be learned on that front. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Barbara and get into the questions.
We have a variety of experience here, as you can well see. From the Fukushima disaster in 2011, which quite some of us in the academic community consider a black swan event because it's one of those catastrophic situations where you've got a significant earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident all at the same time, which creates a lot of challenges. Molly's here and can talk about it from a healthcare issue. Lee and Russ have got extensive background in crisis management for lots of different clients and organizations. So what I'd like to do, obviously I've got many questions that I can ask them, but I'd really like to open it up and make sure that we have time to address the questions that you came with today. Yes?
I have several questions for everyone.
Let's start with just one.
For Kenji, how do you handle, and this might be everyone, how do you handle communications or crisis communications when your infrastructure is suffering? So if it's something catastrophic, how do you get the word out? What do you do?
That's an excellent question. We actually, I don't think there's a simple solution to that. In our case, we lost power, we lost communication means. On-site, off-site, not only us, but the local government, the public, the infrastructure for telecommunications was lost. Even in downtown Tokyo, we couldn't use cell phone systems. So there's no, so one is to make a robust communication system so that we don't lose it in case of, even in case of historically largest earthquake and tsunami. But still, there could be black swan events that could still overwhelm the most robust system. So maybe try to set up like a diverse system that do not rely on a single pole line, and we have multiple batteries and satellite phones and so forth. But still, if we lose everything, we need to think about are there alternative ways of communicating? And also, we need to train ourselves in situation, not only like scripted scenarios for sure, but beyond the scripted scenarios, like blind scenarios where the responders do not know what they will be put in during the drills, and they will have to come up on the fly, creating solutions. So that kind of training on top of preparing as much as possible is the way to go.
And I would add that at Northside Hospital, one of the things that we just recently done, and you mentioned training, and I think that's really probably the key. We trained recently for a tornado drill, and the scenario was that the tornado basically ripped off top 2 floors of our hospital, and there was no power, there was no access in and out of the hospital, there were patients, elevators didn't work, so you had to carry patients. So it was pretty extreme, and I think that you sometimes have to test yourself to the extreme. And our drills, our emergency drills at Northside Hospital, which are done fairly frequently, are always done to failure. And what that means is you test yourselves and your systems and your people until there's a mistake, until something doesn't work, and then you stop. And you say, okay, fine, we don't want this to happen. In reality, let's stop here, let's evaluate how we get beyond the failure mode. But we always test a failure, and I would recommend that.
Can I have one other point, which is it's also important to think not just to the systems, but the people. So we, it seems like everybody, CDC has some robust simulations that we do just about every year. And one of the ones I found most interesting was we did one for pandemic influenza, where people were selected to get influenza. They took team leads and they took leadership figures. And so it also forced us to think about what would happen within our organization if we were impacted with an emergency. Going down the line, who's going to be in charge, who has the expertise, who do we need to cross-train. So I think that's important as well.
Oh, I add one other thing.
Yes,
To you next.
Good job.
It's interesting, we talked about tornadoes. I had the opportunity to go and manage some of the on-site communications for a hospital that experienced a tornado. It was the largest employer in a multi-county area in southern Georgia. Obviously, when your hospital gets demolished, it's not a good thing when there are injuries in light of a tornado. And you absolutely need the planning in place where you have tools that you can put in place, and sometimes you are just left to figure some things out on the fly. When I got on site, they were still bringing in mobile cell towers. So they've got these cellular trailers that they can bring in. It's kind of a mobile hotspot that will allow services to come back up. Very taxed systems with everybody